For 7 years, I've been a widow to a man who isn't dead. Every single month, like clockwork, I wired thousands of dollars to his grieving mother. I skipped vacations, I worked double shifts, and I stayed single, all to support the woman who lost her only son. I thought I was her lifeline. I thought we were bonded by blood and tragedy. I was wrong. I wasn't her daughter-in-law. I was her ATM. My name is Paula, and my life shattered 10 days ago when a neighbor pulled me into the shadows and whispered, "Paula, how much is a ghost worth to you? Because the man you're crying over just carried the groceries into that house." My blood didn't just run cold, it boiled. I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. I went to my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and I waited. Then I saw him, Mark. The man I watched them bury 7 years ago, walking through the front door with a smirk on his face and my hard-earned money in his pocket. If you think this is a story about a woman being a victim, you're wrong. This is a story about what happens when an instructional designer, a woman trained to build systems, decides to dismantle one. Don't go anywhere. Because the trap I set for them is so cold, so calculated, and so humiliating that by the time I was done, they were begging for the mercy I never gave them. You want to see what happens when a good woman finally snaps watch until the end. I promise you, the fallout is a masterpiece. My name is Paula, and at 38 years old, I have built a career defined by precision and systemic order as a senior instructional designer and program director. My life is a series of meticulously mapped objectives and successful outcomes. Yet, for nearly a decade, the core of my private world has been anchored to a tragedy that defied all logic. Before the world saw me as a woman of strength and career-driven discipline, I was simply a woman in love, a woman whose entire future was erased in a single afternoon 7 years ago. The memory of Mark's funeral remains etched in my mind, not as a scene of chaotic despair, but as a masterpiece of sterile, hollow efficiency. It was a cold Tuesday in November when we gathered to say goodbye to the man I intended to marry. Looking back now with the clarity that only the passage of time can provide, the anomalies of that day are glaring, but at 31, blinded by a shroud of suffocating grief, I saw only what I was told to see. The service was small, secluded, and held at a private chapel far from the city where we had built our lives. There were no childhood friends sharing stories of summer mischief, no colleagues from the firm where Mark supposedly worked, and no distant cousins whispering over old photo albums. It was just me, a few paid attendants, and his mother, Evelyn. Evelyn had insisted on a closed casket, citing the horrific nature of the accident, and I had been too broken to argue. I remember the way she clutched my hand, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman who looked like she was about to shatter. She told me that Mark would have wanted it this way, that he hated a spectacle, and that our love was too sacred to be put on display for casual acquaintances. I believed her. I interpreted the crushing silence of that empty chapel as a profound respect for our privacy. I thought the lack of people was a testament to how much he had prioritized our small private world. I didn't realize that the walls of that chapel weren't built to keep the world out. They were built to keep the secret in. It was a controlled environment, a stage managed by Evelyn to ensure that no one who actually knew Mark's history could step forward and ask a question that might bring the whole charade crashing down. In the weeks following the burial, the silence of my apartment became unbearable, but Evelyn never let me drift too far into the darkness. She never once asked me for financial assistance, and that was her greatest trick. She was an architect of emotional debt. We would sit in her dimly lit living room, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and stale tea, and she would talk about how Mark was her only anchor in a world that had grown too fast and too cold. She would lean in, her eyes moist with carefully timed tears, and whisper the words that would tether me to her for the next 7 years. She said, "Paula, you are the only piece of him I have left. Please don't disappear like everyone else. I've lost everything, and I don't think I can survive being alone." In that moment, my sense of duty, which had always been my strongest trait, was weaponized against me. I felt a surge of protective instinct that was almost primal. I was a woman of means, a professional who understood how to manage resources, and I decided then and there that Evelyn would never have to worry about the indignities of a lonely, impoverished old age. It wasn't a legal obligation and there was no signed contract, but to me, it was a sacred vow. I committed to sending her $40,000 a year, a significant portion of my income, to ensure her comfort and her dignity. I saw it as a living memorial to Mark. If he couldn't be here to provide for her, I would do it in his name. It was my way of keeping his spirit alive, of proving that our love had a tangible, lasting impact on the world. For 7 years, my life became a study in stasis. While my colleagues were getting married and starting families, I remained a professional success and a personal ghost. I climbed the corporate ladder, earning promotions and accolades for my ability to streamline complex programs, yet my own heart was stuck in that November chapel. Every month, the wire transfer was the first thing I handled. It became a ritual of my own integrity, a recurring proof that I was a woman who kept her word, no matter the cost. I didn't seek out new relationships because I felt that my energy was already spoken for. My loyalty to a dead man and his surviving mother was a full-time occupation. Evelyn played her part to perfection, always calling to thank me with a voice that sounded just frail enough to justify my continued sacrifice. She would send me photos of her garden or mention a small repair she had made to the house, always framing it through the lens of my generosity. I was the hero of her story, or so I thought. I lived in a modest apartment, drove an older car, and put my own dreams of travel and homeownership on hold, all because I believed that a woman's character is defined by how she honors her promises. I wore my sacrifice like a suit of armor, never suspecting that the woman I was protecting was the one holding the sword to my back. I lived in a world of shadows and echoes, convinced that my self-denial was the highest form of love. I thought I was paying for a widow's peace, never realizing I was actually funding my own replacement. The structure of my life had been so rigid for so long that I didn't recognize the first cracks when they began to appear. I had spent 7 years viewing Evelyn through a veil of shared mourning, believing her house was a sanctuary of grief that mirrored my own stagnant heart. However, a Saturday afternoon visit to deliver a small gift for her birthday became the catalyst for a chilling realization that my carefully constructed reality was flawed. It began with Mrs. Gable, a woman in her late 70s who lived 3 doors down from Evelyn and had been a fixture in that neighborhood for 40 years. I was walking back to my car when she stopped me, her pruning shears in one hand and a look of intense, almost painful scrutiny in her eyes. I had always liked Mrs. Gable, but that day she didn't offer her usual pleasantries about the weather or my career. Instead, she stood at the edge of her rose bushes and watched me with a gaze that felt heavy with a pity I hadn't earned. She tilted her head toward Evelyn's house and spoke in a voice that was barely more than a dry rustle. She told me that it was truly amazing how some people seemed to thrive in the wake of tragedy, while others simply withered away. I started to offer a polite, rehearsed defense about Evelyn's resilience, but Mrs. Gable cut me off with a sharp, knowing look. She said that some people have a gift for making the world pay for their losses over and over again, and then she turned back to her roses without another word. That wasn't the idle gossip of a bored senior citizen. It was a riddle wrapped in a warning. The way she looked at me as if I were a child failing a simple math problem seeded a grain of doubt that I couldn't shake. I found myself standing by my car, looking back at the house I had helped maintain for 7 years, and for the first time, the scenery didn't look like a monument to a lost son. It looked like a puzzle with missing pieces. As a program director, I am trained to spot inefficiencies and anomalies in any system, and as I walked back toward Evelyn's front door under the pretext of having forgotten my keys, I allowed that professional instinct to take the lead. I stopped looking with my heart and started looking with my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the garage door, which was slightly ajar. Inside sat a sleek silver European SUV that I knew for a fact Evelyn didn't have the driving record or the supposed funds to afford. She had told me months ago that she was taking the bus or relying on friends because she couldn't justify the insurance on her old sedan. Yet there it was, the chrome, glinting in the afternoon sun, a vehicle that cost more than my last 2 years of contributions combined. I felt a cold prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I moved to the side window of the kitchen, which had recently been obscured by new, expensive-looking shutters. Through a small gap, I saw a glimpse of a kitchen that was no longer the dated, cozy space I remembered. The old laminate had been replaced by thick, midnight blue quartz, and a high-end commercial-grade stove stood where the temperamental electric range used to be. These weren't the minor repairs of a widow on a fixed income. This was a complete luxury renovation. My mind raced through the numbers, calculating the cost of the stone, the cabinetry, and the labor. $40,000 a year was a generous gift for living expenses, but it was nowhere near enough to fund a total lifestyle transformation of this magnitude, while also paying for the daily upkeep of an estate in this zip code. I stepped onto the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs, and knocked on the door. When Evelyn opened it, she looked exactly as she always did. Frail, draped in a soft cardigan, her hair perfectly coiffed in that silver bob that suggested a woman who had given up on the world. But as I sat on her new velvet sofa, my eyes drifted to the marble coffee table. There, sitting out in the open, was a set of luxury skincare jars, the kind that cost $400 for an ounce and are only found in the most exclusive department stores. I had been buying my own moisturizer at the drugstore to save money for her, yet here she was, draped in the spoils of a windfall she had never mentioned. Every time I tried to steer the conversation toward her finances or the obvious upgrades in the house, she would masterfully pivot back to a story about Mark's childhood or a memory of our engagement. It was a performance I had seen 100 times, but now I could see the strings. I could see the way she watched my eyes tracking where I looked, her own gaze sharp and predatory beneath the facade of the grieving mother. She was managing the room, managing me, and managing the narrative with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. I felt a sudden claustrophobic urge to leave to get away from the cloying scent of her expensive candles and the suffocating weight of her feigned vulnerability. The true shift occurred later that evening. I was back in my apartment staring at my bank statements when my phone rang. It was Evelyn. Usually her calls were long, rambling sessions about her health or her loneliness, but tonight her tone was different. Her voice was trembling, but the questions she asked were surgical in their precision. She didn't ask how I was. She asked if I had run into anyone in the neighborhood during my visit. She specifically mentioned Mrs. Gable calling her a confused, bitter woman who made up stories to get attention. For the first time in 7 years, I felt the cold hand of surveillance. She wasn't checking in to see if I had gotten home safely. She was checking to see if the information Mrs. Gable held had been passed to me. She was performing a soft interrogation, testing the boundaries of what I knew. When I kept my answers brief and neutral, she shifted back to her reliable weapon guilt. She sighed into the receiver, telling me how she had spent the evening crying over Mark's old journals and how thankful she was that I was the only person in the world who hadn't abandoned her. It was a calculated defense mechanism, a preemptive strike designed to make me feel too guilty to ask about the SUV or the quartz countertops. I realized then that our entire relationship was a system of information control. I wasn't her family. I was a source of revenue that needed to be managed and monitored. The pity that had fueled my generosity for nearly a decade began to evaporate, replaced by a crystalline, freezing clarity. For 7 years, I looked at her through the lens of pity. That night, I started looking through the lens of evidence. The shift from mourning to investigation felt like waking up from a long, heavy fever. As a program director, my entire professional identity is built on forensic analysis and the tracking of variables, yet for 7 years, I had left the most critical project of my life unmonitored. That night, I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I sat at my mahogany desk with a pot of black coffee and opened every financial portal I possessed, ready to treat my own life as a failing program that required a total audit. I began with a forensic review of the $280,000 I had funneled to Evelyn since the funeral. I exported 7 years of wire transfers and bank statements into a spreadsheet, expecting to see a simple trail of domestic spending. But as I traced the flow of the funds, the numbers began to tell a story that had nothing to do with a widow's survival. The money wasn't being deposited into Evelyn's local checking account for groceries or utilities. Instead, it was being systematically diverted through a series of offshore digital payment entities, shell companies with names like Apex Management and Coastal Holdings that hadn't even existed when Mark was alive. These weren't accounts for an elderly woman. These were modern sophisticated financial vehicles designed to move capital across state lines without triggering a domestic paper trail. My hands were steady even as my stomach churned because the data was undeniable. I was looking at a strategic extraction plan, a 7-year siphon that had drained my future to feed an invisible machine. The analytical coldness of the spreadsheets provided the how, but a digital ghost provided the where. Around 3 in the morning, I took a break from the numbers and opened my laptop to find something mindless to watch, a habit I used to soothe my nerves. I logged into my family streaming account, a legacy subscription I'd kept active since Mark and I first moved in together. I clicked on the profile settings to update my payment method, and that's when I saw it. There, sitting quietly between my profile and the one I'd set up for my niece, was Mark's profile. I had never had the heart to delete it, viewing it as a digital gravestone. But when I clicked on the viewing history, the air left my lungs. The profile wasn't empty. Over the last 48 hours, someone had been watching a marathon of naval documentaries and historical dramas. I scrolled further back, my heart thundering in my ears, and found a consistent stream of activity spanning years. I pulled up the security logs for the account, looking for the access points, and found a recurring IP address located in a small, affluent coastal town 3 states away. The ghost of my fiancé wasn't just a memory haunting my dreams. He was a living, breathing user sitting in a house somewhere watching television on my credit card. The sheer, mundane audacity of it was what broke the last of my illusions. He wasn't in a grave. He was on a couch, likely laughing at the same shows we used to share while I worked 60-hour weeks to pay for his mother's quartz countertops and his hidden life. In that moment of total revelation, every instinct I had told me to pick up the phone and scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to call Evelyn and tell her I knew everything. I wanted to call the police. But my training as a director kicked in, overriding the surge of adrenaline. If I confronted them now, they would vanish. They had already proven they could fake a death. They could certainly fake a relocation. I needed them to stay exactly where they were while I gathered the rest of my evidence. I chose a path of strategic silence, a controlled response that felt like a deadly game of chess. As I monitored my home network, I realized that my own computer had been accessed remotely several times over the past few months. Someone was using Mark's old shared passwords to keep tabs on my life, likely checking my bank balances to see how much more they could squeeze out of me. Instead of changing the passwords and alerting them to my discovery, I decided to feed the system the bait it craved. I created a fake folder on my desktop labeled Inheritance Documents and drafted a series of dummy emails to a non-existent lawyer discussing a massive 6-figure windfall from a distant relative that was supposedly due to hit my account next month. I watched the cursor on my screen move slightly an hour later, a predatory shadow checking the trap I had just laid. I sat back in the dark, watching the digital intruder read my lies, and realized that for 7 years I had been the one being programmed. No more. Grief is messy and unpredictable. This was too organized. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a business model. The digital breadcrumbs led me to a sleepy coastal town in Delaware, a place of gray shingles and salt-crusted windows, where the air felt as heavy as the secrets it held. I had taken a week of personal leave, telling Evelyn I was overwhelmed with the inheritance paperwork, a move that ensured she would be too distracted by the scent of a fresh windfall to question my sudden absence. I sat in my parked sedan across from a modest, well-kept bungalow at the end of a cul-de-sac, the exact location identified by the IP address. For hours, I watched my hands gripped so tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee that my fingers felt numb. Then the front door opened, and the ghost stepped into the light. Mark didn't look like a man who had been resurrected. He looked like a man who had spent 7 years hiding from the sun. He was older, his hair thinning, his shoulders hunched in a way that suggested a perpetual fear of being seen. He moved toward the mailbox with a furtive, skittish energy, glancing at every passing car, with eyes that were hollow and haunted. This was the man I had mourned with such ferocity that it had nearly consumed me. He hadn't died in a fiery crash. He had faked his death to escape a massive embezzlement scandal at his firm that was about to break just days after our engagement. But as I watched him, the true nature of the betrayal shifted into a more sinister focus. Mark wasn't a criminal mastermind living a life of luxury on my dime. He was a prisoner. I watched as he hurried back inside when a delivery truck rounded the corner, and a few minutes later I saw Evelyn's SUV pull into the driveway. She didn't greet him with the warmth of a mother who had saved her son. She entered that house with the cold, commanding presence of an overseer. I sat there, the engine of my car clicking as it cooled, and I realized the terrifying depth of the double betrayal. Evelyn had convinced Mark that the authorities were still looking for him, that his only hope for survival was to remain dead to the world, buried in this gray town under her thumb. She had used the threat of prison to cage him, and she had used my grief to fund the bars. She was the one managing the offshore accounts. She was the one who had kept the lion's share of the $280,000 to renovate her own life, while Mark lived in a state of perpetual, terrified house arrest. He was a coward who had chosen a fake death over accountability, but Evelyn was the predator who had turned his cowardice into a lucrative business. She had played us both, keeping us in separate soundproof rooms of a house built on my labor and his fear. I wasn't just a victim of a lie. I was a disposable asset in a carefully calculated financial portfolio. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, yet it didn't bring tears. Instead, it brought a profound, logical chill that settled deep into my marrow. I began to look back at our engagement through this new, freezing lens. Evelyn hadn't encouraged our relationship because she saw me as a perfect match for her son's heart. She had scouted me. She had seen a woman with a high six-figure salary, a spotless professional reputation, and a moral compass so rigid it could be used to set a watch. She didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted a reliable long-term scholarship for her retirement. She knew that if Mark died, my sense of duty and my middle-class guilt would make me an unquestioning financier for her secret life. My rigid ethics, the very thing I took the most pride in, had been my greatest vulnerability. She had bet on the fact that I would never stop paying, never stop caring, and never stop believing in the sanctity of a promise. She had been right for 7 years. She had banked on my endurance, using my strength as the very tool to enslave me in a loop of perpetual sacrifice. Standing outside that bungalow after Evelyn drove away, I felt a strange, detached sensation, as if I were looking down at my own life from a great height. The woman who had wept into her pillow for years, the woman who had lived in a museum of dead memories, she was gone. In her place was the program director, the woman who knew how to identify a catastrophic system failure and execute a total shutdown. I understood now that my endurance wasn't a virtue in this house. It was a weakness. To win, I had to stop being the woman who carried the weight and start being the woman who dropped it. The fire of my anger didn't burn hot. It burned blue, a steady, concentrated flame of intent. I took out my phone and began to document the house, the car, and the man through the window, each photo a nail in the coffin of their deception. I wasn't going to call the police yet, and I wasn't going to confront them with a scream. I was going to let them believe the inheritance was coming. I was going to let them dream of more of my money while I meticulously prepared to incinerate their world from the inside out. I had spent 7 years building their sanctuary. I would spend the next 7 days ensuring it became their ruin. I looked at the dark windows of the house one last time before driving away, finally understanding the true criteria of my selection. They didn't choose me for my heart. They chose me because they knew my conscience wouldn't let me stop paying until I was empty. The following weeks were a masterclass in strategic deception, a performance that required every ounce of my professional discipline. I returned from Delaware and immediately went to Evelyn's house wearing a mask of exhausted excitement. I told her the inheritance had been finalized, a staggering sum that would change everything, but before the final dispersal, I wanted to do something profound to honor the 7-year anniversary of Mark's passing. I proposed a grand gala, a celebration of Mark's life that would serve as my final public tribute before I moved on to this new chapter. Evelyn's eyes practically glazed over with greed as she calculated the potential of this new windfall. She threw herself into the planning, inviting her entire social circle, her prestigious church group, and even members of the local press she had cultivated to maintain her image as the community's most tragic noble widow. She believed this event was the ultimate validation of her control, a crowning achievement where she would be heralded for her strength while securing her financial future. I spent a small fortune on the venue, a historic ballroom draped in white lilies and crystal, ensuring that every person who mattered in Evelyn's world would be in attendance. I wanted the stage to be perfect, the lighting to be flattering, and the audience to be witnesses to a truth they could never unsee. The night of the gala arrived, and the room was a sea of pearls, dark suits, and hushed, respectful whispers. Evelyn stood at the entrance like a queen mother draped in silk, accepting condolences that she wore like jewels. When it was time for the program to begin, the lights dimmed and I took my place at the podium. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the expectation of a sentimental, tear-filled eulogy. I looked out at the faces of people who had spent 7 years pitying a woman who was robbing me blind. I began by speaking of legacy, and the weight of promises kept my voice steady and clear. Then I turned toward the large projection screen behind me. I told the audience that after 7 years of silence, I had decided to provide a final comprehensive report on the Mark Memorial Fund. With a click of a remote, the screen didn't display a childhood photo of Mark. Instead, it flickered to life with a high-definition financial transparency report that I had designed with the same surgical precision I used for my corporate audits. The room gasped as the screen displayed a forensic map of the $280,000 I had contributed. I showed the offshore accounts the digital routing to Apex Management and the luxury upgrades to Evelyn's home that she had hidden from her charity friends. But I didn't stop at the money. I clicked to the next slide, and the collective intake of breath sounded like a gale-force wind. There, in crystal-clear photos taken just days ago, was Mark. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a man in his late 30s, very much alive, standing in the driveway of a bungalow in Delaware. I displayed the Netflix logs, the IP address histories, and the bank records that linked every cent of my loyalty to the maintenance of this living lie. I announced to the stunned crowd that I had already filed a formal lawsuit for fraudulent inducement and that the FBI had been briefed on the faked death and the 7 years of tax evasion that had followed. I looked directly at Evelyn, whose face had transitioned from a mask of mourning to a ghastly ashen shade of horror. She tried to stand her mouth working, but no sound coming out, as the social fabric of her life began to tear apart in real time. The final phase of the evening was the most satisfying because it was so utterly quiet. I walked down from the stage as 2 plainclothes officers whom I had invited as my personal guests moved toward the front of the room. I didn't scream at Evelyn. I didn't give her the satisfaction of my anger or the drama of a public spat. Instead, I approached her at her table where her friends were already physically recoiling from her, their expressions shifting from sympathy to a visceral, stinging disgust. In this social circle, being a thief was a crime, but being a fraudulent, manipulative liar who exploited a grieving woman was a social death sentence from which there was no resurrection. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a certified letter, and laid it gently on the table in front of her. It was an itemized bill for $280,000 plus 7 years of compounded interest and legal fees. I told her that my lawyer would be in touch regarding the foreclosure on her home to settle the debt. Evelyn looked around the room, her eyes searching for a single ally, a single person to stand by her, but she found only a wall of cold, judgmental silence. Her reputation, the only thing she truly valued more than my money, had been incinerated in less than 10 minutes. The son she had caged was now a liability she couldn't afford, and the daughter-in-law she had exploited was now the woman who owned her future. As the officer stepped forward to escort her out for questioning regarding the fraudulent death certificate, I turned and walked toward the exit. I felt light, as if I had finally shed a skin that had been suffocating me for nearly a decade. I didn't look back to see her being led away. I didn't need to. The system she had built had been dismantled by its own architect. The widow was dead, and for the first time in 7 years, I was the one who was truly alive. I stepped out into the cool night air, the lilies and the crystal and the lies fading behind me. I didn't just take my money back. I took back the air they were breathing at my expense. The aftermath of the gala was not an explosion, but a cold, steady implosion that leveled everything Evelyn and Mark had built on the foundation of my life. The system was so heavily dependent on the $40,000 I funneled into it every year that the moment I pulled the plug, the entire structure lacked the structural integrity to stand. Mark was forced out of the shadows and into a courtroom facing the original embezzlement charges he had cowardice fled from 7 years ago, now compounded by federal charges for faking a death and defrauding a domestic partner. I watched from a distance as he stood before a judge looking small and broken, without his mother's shielding hand, a man who had traded his youth for a cage and was now trading his freedom for a cell. Evelyn's fate was perhaps more poetic in its cruelty. Stripped of her assets through my civil suit, her house foreclosed upon to repay the debt she owed me. She ended up in the very state of lonely, desperate poverty she had once used as a fictional weapon to manipulate my heart. Her social circle vanished overnight, the church groups and charity committees erasing her name as if it were a stain. She was left with nothing but the silence of an empty apartment, finally experiencing the isolation she had forced me to live in while she spent my future on quartz and silk. It was a total collapse, a reminder that a life built on a lie is a house built on sand, and when the tide of truth finally comes in, there is nothing left to salvage. A week after the final court documents were signed, and the last wire transfer of my recovered funds hit my account, I drove out to the cemetery one last time. I walked to the headstone that bore Mark's name, a granite slab that had served as the altar for my grief for nearly a decade. For years, I had come here with flowers and tears talking to the dirt as if it could hear me. Today, I brought something else. I didn't bring roses or lilies. I brought a laminated copy of the court order declaring the death certificate void and the restitution judgment against his estate. I tucked it into the flower holder and stood there for a long moment, not in anger, but in a state of profound, crystalline peace. Looking at that name, I realized that my loyalty hadn't been a weakness or a flaw. It was a superpower, a testament to the depth of my character and the strength of my word. My only mistake was giving that power to people who were too small to deserve it. I was closing the chapter not by forgetting the woman I was, but by reclaiming her. I walked away from that grave without looking back, knowing that the man I loved had never really existed, and the man who did exist wasn't worth another minute of my time. The process of erasure was systematic and liberating. I sold the house I had stayed in for 7 years, a place that felt more like a waiting room than a home. I spent weeks purging my digital footprint, closing old accounts, and changing the passwords that had once allowed predators to peek into my soul. I hired a specialized firm to ensure that Paula the grieving widow was scrubbed from the internet, leaving only Paula the senior director, the strategist, the survivor. I began to map out a new life where responsibility was a shared venture, not a stolen one. I realized that for my entire adult life, I had been an instructional designer of other people's comfort, a woman who built systems to support everyone but herself. No more. I was 38, and for the first time, my high 6-figure salary belonged entirely to me. My time belonged to me. My future was no longer a debt to be paid, but a mountain to be climbed. I felt a surge of energy that was purely mine, a sense of power that came from knowing I could survive the worst betrayal and come out not just whole, but upgraded. As I stood on the deck of my new home, a small but elegant place overlooking the water where the air smelled of salt and possibility, I watched the sun begin to dip below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple and gold, a beautiful fleeting transition between what was and what will be. I thought about the millions of women who might be standing where I once stood, women who stay because they are loyal women, who give until they are empty because they believe it is their duty to carry the weight of a world that doesn't care if they break. I wanted to tell them that endurance is only a virtue if the person you are enduring for is worth the weight. I had transitioned from being the administrator of my own misery to being the architect of my own joy. I had spent 7 years in a prison of my own integrity, but I had finally found the key. I wasn't just wealthy in a financial sense. I was wealthy in the only way that matters. I owned my own narrative. The silence that once felt like a vacuum now felt like a canvas. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of a heart that was no longer anchored to a grave. I had kept my promise to myself, and that was the only promise that ever truly mattered. Loyalty is not a lifetime sentence. it is a gift, and I've finally decided to give it back to myself. As the final gavel fell on the ruins of Evelyn and Mark's deception, I found myself standing in the light of a truth that had been hidden for 7 years. This journey was never just about the money. It was about the reclamation of a soul that had been colonized by guilt and parasitic greed. I hope my story serves as a reminder to every woman who has ever felt that her kindness was a weakness, or that her loyalty was a burden she was forced to carry alone. You have the right to audit your life, to question the systems you support, and to walk away from anyone who views your heart as a resource to be mined. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own strength, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join our community of resilient storytellers. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to revoke a promise to save yourself? How did you find the courage to put your own peace first? Your stories and your insights are the heartbeat of this channel, and seeing your strength inspires me to keep sharing these truths. Let's continue to support one another as we transition from the designers of others' expectations to the architects of our own destinies. Remember, your loyalty is a precious gift. Do not waste it on those who only seek to deplete you. Loyalty is not a lifetime sentence. It is a gift, and I've finally decided to give it back to myself.